Have you ever wondered why love, something that once felt so alive, can slowly turn into silence? It doesn't happen all at once. It fades quietly, not because there's shouting, not because there's betrayal, but because two people who once shared everything start living side by side without truly seeing each other. It's a silent drift, one that leaves a woman lying awake at night wondering, where did the connection go? This isn't about whether love exists. It's about what happens when love is no longer nurtured. In today's story, we're going to walk alongside a woman named Emily. She's 58 years old, married for over 30 years. She's not in a bad marriage, but she is in a quiet one. And for the first time in her life, she begins to question, is this all love becomes? Her journey takes her beyond her daily routine, to the doorstep of Ruth, a 75-year-old woman known not for academic credentials, but for something far rarer, wisdom earned through time, experience, and the quiet observation of hearts in motion. What Ruth shares is not a miracle fix. It's not romance advice from a magazine. It's the kind of insight that gently rearranges everything you thought you understood about connection. By the end of this story, you may find yourself looking at your own relationship differently, more honestly, more hopefully, and perhaps with the courage to begin again. So stay with me, because sometimes the smallest shift in how we see love can bring the biggest change in how we live it. Let's begin. Emily had always believed that love was something that, once found, would simply remain. She met Thomas when they were both in their mid-20s, two dreamers building a life from scratch. In those early years, love felt effortless. Conversations stretched late into the night. There was laughter, spontaneous road trips, and quiet moments that needed no words. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Now, 32 years later, she sat at the edge of their bed, staring into the soft glow of a lamp. The house was quiet, and Thomas was asleep beside her. But what weighed on her wasn't the silence in the room. It was the silence between them. There had been no argument, no betrayal, just a slow, gradual disappearance of warmth. They still shared meals, discussed the news, even remembered to wish each other happy anniversary, but something essential had gone missing. The closeness, the light in his eyes when he looked at her, the way her name used to sound when he said it with affection. Emily wasn't angry. She was lonely. And perhaps the most painful part was knowing that Thomas wasn't cruel or inattentive. He was simply detached, as if their love had turned into a partnership of logistics. Who's paying the bills? What's for dinner? What time is your doctor's appointment? One evening, while sorting through an old photo album, Emily came across a picture of her grandmother. It stirred a memory, something she hadn't thought of in decades. Her grandmother used to speak of a woman named Ruth, an elder who lived outside the city, someone people came to not for quick fixes, but for real clarity. Go see her when your heart forgets how to speak, her grandmother once said. At the time, Emily had dismissed it as one of those old sayings people repeat without meaning. But now, with the weight in her chest growing heavier each day, she felt the tug of that forgotten advice. She didn't tell Thomas where she was going. There was no confrontation, no drama, just a quiet decision to search for something she no longer knew how to name. She packed a weekend bag, got in the car, and drove out of the city, into the kind of countryside where time moves slower and the air feels just a bit softer. It wasn't logic that guided her, it was longing. And beneath that longing, a quiet hope. That somewhere out there, perhaps there was still a way back to love that felt alive. Not loud, not perfect, just real. When Emily arrived, the village felt like a different world. Tucked between tall trees and winding fields, it was quiet in the way that invites reflection. A few birds called out in the distance, and the wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. It reminded her of childhood summers, long forgotten. She followed a narrow path that led to a small, ivy-covered home, just as her grandmother had described. There were herbs hanging from the porch, and a small wooden sign carved with a single name. For a moment, Emily hesitated. Was she really about to pour out her heart to a stranger? But something deeper than doubt pushed her forward. She knocked gently. The door creaked open. There stood Ruth, older than Emily had imagined, with long gray hair tied loosely and eyes that seemed to hold 100 unspoken stories. Her presence was calm, her expression kind. Without asking a single question, she stepped aside and said, "You've come a long way. Come in. Let's sit." Inside, the room was warm and simple. A fire crackled gently in the hearth. Books lined the shelves. There was a worn rug underfoot and the scent of chamomile in the air. Ruth poured 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of Emily. "No need to rush," she said softly. "Just tell me what's resting on your heart." Emily's eyes stung with tears she hadn't allowed herself to feel. She looked down at her hands and began. "I love my husband," she said quietly, "but I feel invisible. We still live together, we still talk, but we don't connect, not really. I feel like I'm holding on to something that's already slipped away." Ruth didn't interrupt, she simply listened. Emily continued, her voice steadier now. "We've been together for over 3 decades. We raised kids, we built a life, but now it's like we're just roommates. There's no anger, just silence, and I don't know how to break through it." Ruth nodded slowly, as if she'd heard this story many times before. "You're not alone," she said gently. "Most couples don't fall out of love, they fall out of attention. They stop seeing each other, not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped remembering how." Emily exhaled, the words washing over her like a bomb. And then Ruth added quietly, "But there's something important you must understand before anything can change." She leaned in, her eyes clear and kind. "Love is not the same as connection. And that, my dear, is where we begin." Emily leaned in, her curiosity piqued. Ruth's tone shifted, calm but certain, as if what she was about to say was something most people miss their entire lives. "Many people confuse love with connection," Ruth began, "but they are not the same." Emily looked puzzled. "Aren't they linked?" "They are," Ruth said, "but love is the seed, connection is the tending. Love can exist quietly in the background, but without connection it withers, not because it disappears, but because it's been left untended." She let the words hang there before continuing. "You see, love is a feeling, but connection is a choice. It's a series of small daily actions. It's looking up when your partner walks into the room. It's asking how they slept and listening, really listening, when they answer. It's remembering how they like their tea or the way their shoulders tense when they're carrying too much." Emily nodded slowly, her fingers wrapped around her cup. Ruth smiled gently. "You can love someone deeply and still feel like strangers. That's what happens to most couples. They assume love will carry the relationship through everything. But love without connection is like music without sound, present but unheard. Emily sat back, thinking. "So," she asked quietly, "what happened to us?" Ruth tilted her head. "What happens to everyone who stops noticing? Routines creep in. Conversations shrink to logistics. We begin to assume instead of asking. And eventually, the emotional door between us closes, not out of malice, but out of habit." There was no judgment in her voice, just truth. Emily thought about the quiet dinners, the mornings spent reading the news side by side without a word, the absence of touch that used to come so naturally. She had assumed the love was still there, and maybe it was, but the bridge that once connected their hearts had slowly faded. "Love isn't enough if we stop choosing each other," Ruth said. "Connection must be rebuilt, moment by moment, day by day, and it starts with one question." Emily looked up. "When was the last time," Ruth asked gently, "that you looked into his eyes and he saw you truly seeing him?" Emily swallowed hard. It had been years, and in that moment she realized this wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic change. It was about attention, presence, effort. Love was the foundation, but connection, that was the work. Ruth stood and walked slowly to the bookshelf near the window, running her fingers across the worn spines of her favorite titles. Then she turned back to Emily with a calm intensity in her eyes. "You want to understand intimacy," she said, "then you need to understand this. For women, intimacy begins in the heart, not the bedroom." Emily blinked. "But we've always, he tries." Ruth held up a hand gently. "Trying is not the same as understanding. Most men think that affection starts with physical touch, but for a woman, if her heart feels distant, her body will close off, not out of rejection, but out of self-protection." She paused, letting the weight of that truth land. "You could be sitting next to each other on the couch every night and still be miles apart," Ruth continued. "You could share a bed and still feel lonely, because true closeness isn't just about touch. It's about trust, safety, emotional connection." Emily's thoughts drifted. She remembered the way her husband used to hold her hand while driving, the way he used to brush the hair from her face just to make her smile. Somewhere along the way, those moments stopped. Not abruptly, just gradually, replaced by routine, by distraction, by tiredness. "He talks to me," Emily said softly. "But it's usually about the house, the bills, practical things." "And when he touches you," Ruth asked, "does it feel like a habit or a question?" Emily looked down. "Lately, it feels more like an obligation, like something to check off." "That," Ruth said, "is the silent shift that steals passion. A woman begins to feel invisible, not because she is unloved, but because she is emotionally untouched. And without that emotional touch, physical affection becomes hollow, mechanical, and sometimes even painful." Emily's chest tightened. She had been blaming herself for not wanting more, for pulling away, but now she realized it wasn't about desire. It was about the lack of connection that made desire feel impossible. "Intimacy," Ruth said, "isn't something you earn at the end of the day. It's something you build all day long, with small gestures, with presence, with curiosity. If a man wants to touch her body, he must first reach her heart." Silence settled between them. Then Ruth added, "And the beautiful thing is, it's never too late to start, but you have to start where she feels." Emily nodded, eyes misted with clarity. She finally understood. Her distance wasn't rejection. It was a quiet cry to be seen. Ruth stood and walked slowly to the bookshelf near the window, running her fingers across the worn spines of her favorite titles. Then she turned back to Emily with a calm intensity in her eyes. "You want to understand intimacy," she said. "Then you need to understand this. For women, intimacy begins in the heart, not the bedroom." Emily blinked. "But we've always, he tries." Ruth held up a hand gently. "Trying is not the same as understanding. Most men think that affection starts with physical touch, but for a woman, if her heart feels distant, her body will close off, not out of rejection, but out of self-protection." She paused, letting the weight of that truth land. "You could be sitting next to each other on the couch every night and still be miles apart," Ruth continued. "You could share a bed and still feel lonely, because true closeness isn't just about touch. It's about trust, safety, emotional connection." Emily's thoughts drifted. She remembered the way her husband used to hold her hand while driving, the way he used to brush the hair from her face just to make her smile. Somewhere along the way, those moments stopped, not abruptly, just gradually, replaced by routine, by distraction, by tiredness. "He talks to me," Emily said softly. "But it's usually about the house, the bills, practical things." "And when he touches you," Ruth asked, "does it feel like a habit or a question?" Emily looked down. "Lately, it feels more like an obligation, like something to check off." "That," Ruth said, "is the silent shift that steals passion." A woman begins to feel invisible, not because she is unloved, but because she is emotionally untouched. And without that emotional touch, physical affection becomes hollow, mechanical, and sometimes even painful. Emily's chest tightened. She had been blaming herself for not wanting more, for pulling away, but now she realized it wasn't about desire. It was about the lack of connection that made desire feel impossible. "Intimacy," Ruth said, "isn't something you earn at the end of the day. It's something you build all day long. With small gestures, with presence, with curiosity. If a man wants to touch her body, he must first reach her heart." Silence settled between them. Then Ruth added, "And the beautiful thing is, it's never too late to start, but you have to start where she feels." Emily nodded, eyes misted with clarity. She finally understood. Her distance wasn't rejection. It was a quiet cry to be seen. Ruth reached for the teapot again, refilling Emily's cup without saying a word. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was reflective. Emily's mind was still unraveling the realization that love wasn't just about being together. It was about staying connected in the moments that matter most. Then Ruth leaned back, her gaze softening, but her words gaining weight. "There's something else you need to understand," she said. "Even the most loving couples can lose their spark, not because the love is gone, but because the rhythm of life takes over. And when routine becomes the master of the relationship, desire slowly slips away without either person noticing." Emily sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what it feels like. We've fallen into patterns. We do what we're supposed to. We check the boxes. But it's like the passion got left behind years ago." "That's what routine does," Ruth said. "It numbs the parts of us that once felt alive. It turns affection into habit, conversation into updates, and love into obligation." She paused for a moment, letting the fire crackle in the background, then continued. "Do you remember when you first met your husband?" she asked. "How every touch felt electric, how a simple glance could make your whole day brighter? That wasn't magic, it was presence. It was the energy of two people choosing each other again and again. Emily smiled faintly at the memory, a time when just hearing his voice made her heart flutter. That excitement, Ruth said, isn't lost. It's just buried under years of routines, responsibilities, and assumptions. To bring it back, you don't need grand gestures. You need intention. Emily nodded slowly. But how? Where do I even begin? You begin, Ruth said, by doing what you used to do. When love was new, when everything was uncertain and exciting. Tease him, laugh over silly things, reach for his hand when he's not expecting it, leave a note on his pillow. These are not childish things. These are the very things that keep desire alive. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Ruth leaned forward and asked, "When was the last time you kissed him just because you wanted to, not because it was expected?" Emily opened her mouth, but no answer came. That silence said everything. Ruth gently smiled, not in judgment, but with the kind of compassion only age and experience could offer. "You see, my dear," she said softly, "desire doesn't disappear with time. It disappears with neglect, not of the body, but of the heart. When we stop seeing each other as lovers and start seeing each other only as co-managers of a household, we lose something sacred. Not because the love is gone, but because we stop expressing it." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "I think I stopped trying because I thought he stopped caring." Ruth reached out and placed her hand over Emily's. That's how it usually starts. Both people waiting for the other to make the first move. But here's what most don't realize. Love in a long-term relationship isn't a spark you wait for. It's a fire you have to tend. Every day, with small, deliberate acts. The room fell into a hush, and for a moment only the sounds of the fire crackling and the teacups clinking could be heard. Ruth leaned back in her chair. You'd be surprised how quickly the heart reawakens when it feels seen again, when you start showing affection not because it's expected, but because you genuinely want to reconnect. Emily wiped the corner of her eye and let out a shaky laugh. "I always thought passion was something that just faded with age." "Oh no," Ruth chuckled. "Passion doesn't fade with age. It fades with inattention. You can be 60 or 70 and still feel butterflies, but only if you keep feeding what makes love feel alive. Surprise each other, compliment each other, make time, not just spend time." She paused, then said something that stayed with Emily long after she left the cottage. You don't fall out of love because time passes. You fall out of love when you stop treating each other like you're worth the effort. So if you want to feel alive again in love, start bringing life back into it, one small gesture at a time. Emily took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't overwhelmed by the gap between them. Instead, she saw a bridge, one that could be rebuilt, step by step, not with big speeches or sudden changes, but with consistent care. The fire between them hadn't died. It was just waiting for someone to strike the match. Ruth stood slowly and walked to a small shelf by the window. She retrieved a leather-bound notebook and opened it to a page filled with handwritten notes. "Let me show you something," she said, her voice warm but purposeful. Emily leaned in, curious. "These," Ruth explained, "are the 3 habits I've seen revive the deepest, most tired kinds of love. They're simple, but don't let that fool you. The smallest acts, done consistently, are what breathe life back into a relationship." She tapped the first line with her finger. First, emotional presence. That means being truly with your partner, when you're together, not just physically. Put down your phone, turn off the background noise, look them in the eyes, ask questions that matter. Ask them what they dreamed about as a child, what they're afraid of now, what they hope for in the future, not because you need answers, but because you want to know them again. Emily nodded slowly, remembering how rarely she and her husband had deep conversations anymore. Their talks were mostly about errands, work schedules, or the thermostat. Ruth continued, "Second, unexpected affection, not routine gestures, but moments that feel real, playful, and spontaneous. A hug when he walks in the door, a kiss on the cheek while he's making coffee, a note slipped into his wallet that says, 'You still make my heart skip.' These things don't cost anything, but they make your partner feel desired. And that's what keeps the connection alive. And third," she said, closing the notebook and looking up, "daily appreciation. Tell your partner what you admire about them, not just what they do, but who they are. Say, 'Thank you for being patient with me today,' or 'I'm proud of the man you are.' Those words go deeper than any romantic dinner." Emily felt something shift inside her. These weren't just actions, these were bridges between hearts that had drifted, between a past that still mattered and a future that could still be beautiful. Ruth placed the notebook gently into Emily's hands. "Write your own version of these habits. Make them yours. It's not about copying what worked for me. It's about discovering what your love needs now and giving it freely, often, with your whole heart." Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the hills, casting long golden rays across the quiet village. And in that stillness, Emily felt ready. Not because she had all the answers, but because for the first time in a long time, she knew where to begin. Emily left the cottage with the notebook held gently in her hands, like something sacred. The walk back home felt different, lighter. The trees swayed gently overhead, and the wind felt softer, as if the world had noticed the shift within her. She wasn't returning as the same woman who had left. She had come searching for answers. But what Ruth gave her was something even more powerful: clarity. When Emily stepped into her home that evening, the silence was still there. But this time, she didn't fear it. She looked across the room at her husband. He sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, unaware of the transformation unfolding just a few steps away. She walked up behind him, gently placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "I missed you today." He looked up, surprised, not by the words, but by the tenderness in her voice. It had been a long time since either of them had spoken with that kind of softness. That night, instead of sitting apart on opposite sides of the couch, they shared a quiet moment on the porch. Emily asked him how he was, really. And for the first time in what felt like years, she listened with both ears and her whole heart. In the days that followed, things didn't change overnight. There were still dishes to wash and bills to pay, but little by little, the invisible wall between them began to dissolve. It was in the way he looked at her when she brought him coffee without asking. It was in the way she reached for his hand during walks again. It was in the laughter they shared over a memory that neither had spoken about in years. Their love hadn't died. It had simply fallen asleep. And now they were both gently waking it up. What Emily discovered through Ruth wasn't a secret formula. It was a quiet invitation to stop waiting for love to fix itself and start choosing love with intention every day in small, deliberate ways. Because love isn't lost all at once. It's lost in the pauses, the assumptions, the silence. and it's rebuilt in the whispers, the effort, the presence. So, if you're wondering where the spark has gone, maybe it's waiting for you to light the match.